All right, welcome back to our next session. It's a discussion on current and future space policy. This session is generously supported by our full day sponsor, Lockheed Martin, as well as Maxar and Teledyne Brown Engineering. Thank you to each of these three. Now, this was one of those little panels that are difficult to put together, primarily because we didn't want to get into the discussion of good policy. Are the policies good? What should we do to change policies in this election year? So we decided to talk about policy. And so we're going to be hearing from some of the experts in this area. And our moderator for this session is Dan Dumbacher, who is Executive Director of the AIAA. Dan, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Alan, and good afternoon to everyone, or whatever the appropriate greeting is for the time zone you are in. We want to spend some time today, as Alan said, talking about space policy, and the topics might be a little bit different than normal because we want to talk it in more of a broader sense. The three main topics we're going to talk about today are: why do we talk in terms of three different space policy stovepipes, those being civil space, commercial space, and national security space? What are the intersections across these policy stovepipes that need to be addressed, and examples of those intersections? And what are the near-term policy decisions required of policymakers, no matter what the results are of next week's elections? If we have time, we'll get into the external environment affecting future space policy, and also some of the necessary mechanisms that we need to assure the long-term progress. So for today, we have three wonderful panelists. First, we have Marcia Smith, founder and editor of SpacePolicyOnline.com. Welcome, Marcia. John Logsdon has joined us, Professor Emeritus, George Washington University Space Policy Institute, and Jeff Foust, whom we all know, senior staff writer with SpaceNews. So welcome, everyone. To kick this off, first I might go to Dr. Logsdon and have him give us the historical perspective of why we talk in terms of these three stovepipes for policy, and recognizing the time that we have, 33 minutes. John, if you could keep it to 4 to 5 minutes, along with Marcia and Jeff, the same instructions will apply. 4 to 5 minutes, please give us your perspective on why we talk in terms of these three stovepipes.
Well, Dan, it was built into the system from the start. I mean, there was a debate in 1958 of how to organize the U.S. for space in reaction to Sputnik. And President Eisenhower thought about one great department of space. It's a quote from a recording of his meeting. And it was Richard Nixon that said, no, we really should separate civilian and national security space so that we could have a program that engages with the world, that's outward looking, that is not secret, that's open to all, and at the same time carry out a national security space program classified when necessary. So, I mean, there was a decision to form a separate civilian space agency, and all of the structure that grew up around that became that stovepipe. A decision at the same time to separate kind of white military space and black military space in the Air Force primarily and NRO, stovepipe that grew up around that. Then in 1962-ish, when communication satellites became a reality, a discussion of how to organize for that, and a discussion to have a new hybrid organization that evolved into ComSat and Intelsat, and created the start of commercial space. I wouldn't call it a stovepipe. It's just a different area of activity with different modes of operation. The government doesn't seek a profit, the private sector does. And so, I mean, space, to use a cliche, is just a place to do different things. And there are different things in the civil sector, in the national security sector, and in the commercial sector. So I think it's kind of natural that these separate activities have grown up. I'm not even sure they're a stovepipe.
Oh, well, great, John. Thank you very much. That's a great, it's always good to understand the history and how we got to where we are. Jeff, if I could lean on you maybe a little bit to give us some idea from your perspective what some of the near-term steps are that need to be taken independent of election results next week.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I know everyone's focused on the presidential election as well as the congressional elections next week. But regardless of the outcome of those elections, and regardless of when those outcomes are decided, there are still a lot of issues for Congress to deal with before the end of this calendar year. And I think first and foremost, obviously, is appropriations. NASA, along with the rest of the federal government, is operating under a continuing resolution stopgap funding bill that runs through December 11th. So sometime between now and December 11th, Congress will have to decide whether to do another stopgap spending bill for some period of time, or to come up with a final omnibus spending bill for fiscal year 2021. And obviously, there are a lot of issues involved with that. NASA has asked for a big budget increase. The House has been less willing to provide that. There are some specific issues regarding, in particular, the Human Landing System program. If you were on earlier today and heard the administrator speaking and talking about how grateful he was that the House included some funding for HLS. The message there is that they want more money. The $600 million is not enough to enable HLS to stay on track to enable humans to return to the moon by 2024. NASA asked for $3.2 billion. They hope the Senate will come through when the Senate comes up with its version of a spending bill, which it hasn't so far. And that gets worked out when the House and Senate work out their differences in conference. Obviously, a lot of other spending issues there, but HLS really rises to the top when you hear all this talk about Artemis and the 2024 lunar landing goal and keeping that on track. But I mean, there are lots of, there's obviously many military space programs, funding for Space Force programs. There are also smaller issues. The Office of Space Commerce in the Commerce Department is asking for $15 million, not billion, million, to do space traffic management work. The House didn't include that funding. They wanted to see what an independent report would say about space traffic management responsibilities. That report tended to be favorable to the Commerce Department. We'll see if Congress will open up the purse strings in response. Now, there's some other legislative issues to deal with. There are separate House and Senate versions of a NASA authorization bill, for example. The House version is still sitting in the House Science Committee. The Senate version has passed through the Senate Commerce Committee, but there's still negotiations about, provisions in that bill that would enable it to be passed by what's known as unanimous consent, which is, as the name suggests, getting all 100 senators to agree on the bill, because that's really about the only way to get a bill like that through the Senate, given the time available. So there'll be some interesting discussions about that. But if we don't get a NASA authorization bill this year, we can try again next year. It's not like NASA programs will grind to a halt without it, unlike an appropriations bill where NASA does need the money to do that. And likewise, you'll see some similar interest in a recent Senate bill called the Space Act regarding space traffic management. So we'll see if we see some action on that. And all that, really, a lot of it has to happen between now and the end of the calendar year. In order to get the funding bills passed, in order to get some of this legislation passed before a new Congress starts in January, and they'd have to start over on these various bills. So regardless of what happens next week in the election, there's still a lot to deal with regarding space policies in Congress in the next several weeks.
Thank you, Jeff. Greatly appreciate that. So Marcia, let's turn our attention a little bit to what are those policy intersection, cross-cutting lanes that need to be addressed, and any examples that you might be able to lay out for us on to show how those intersections need to be addressed.
It was great to hear John's recounting of how we got to where we are with these three sort of separate stovepipes: commercial, civil, and national security, over the history of the space program. But as things have evolved over these past decades, I think there have been many more instances where there have been intersectoral combinations coming along. And of course, right now, everyone talks about the whole of government approach to space policy. And it's not just within government agencies, but it's with the government and the commercial sector. So I think that we're seeing more and more of an intersectoral combination coming along. And I think what Jeff just brought up with space traffic management is a perfect example. You have the Department of Commerce, a government agency, civil government agency, working with the Department of Defense and National Security Agency, trying to create this open architecture data repository of data so that DOC can assume this responsibility of doing tracking of space objects and providing warnings of collisions to the commercial sector. And eventually that repository also bringing in data from the commercial sector, because now you have a growing commercial sector of companies who are actually able to track satellites themselves and make their own what are called conjunction analyses or collision warnings. So I think that you are seeing a lot of instances where you have all of these groups coming together, working together, finding ways to benefit from the cooperation. And I was looking back at the most recent national space policy that came out in 2010, and it actually begins with the intersectoral policies. I mean, there's goals and principles, but when you actually get into the policy part of it, it begins with intersector, and then you get into the civil, commercial, and national security. So I think that it was beginning even a decade ago to take this broader view of how the entire space community, government, commercial, everybody is working together in order to accomplish everything in space. So I do think there is a lot more of that going on these days, certainly than there was at the beginning of the space program. I mean, ComSat, the Communication Satellite Act that created ComSat, that was the beginning of commercial space. And then there was another big bump up in the 1980s with commercial space launch services and commercial remote sensing. But really commercial space, in the way we think about it today, is really coming into its own as we're speaking. So I think that's going to really be the direction that everybody moves in as time goes by. And there are other areas where the commercial sector and the government need to find a way to get along, like in spectrum sharing. Spectrum is a huge issue right now. Anybody who uses anything over the airwaves needs to have spectrum. And you have the FCC that does it for the private sector and NTIA that does it for the government sector. Everybody wants spectrum. It's a finite natural resource. And you're finding, fights between the terrestrial and the satellite people and fights between the government and the commercial sector. So that's another intersectoral area where people, I think, are having more battles than they are having success in working together. But ultimately, they need to find a way to work together. So I see this as a growing trend.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marcia. I want to transition this discussion just a little bit. And I want to, in the interest of time, because I want to make sure we have time for Q&A, I want to try to keep this to maybe 10 minutes of kind of a roundtable discussion and open this up to all of you in terms of, given where we are today and the progress that's been made over the last several years, what do you think what do you think is working now that we need to continue, and how would we implement that for the future so that we continue to build on the momentum that we have going on across all of the space activity, that be in national security, commercial, and civil. So John, I'll start off with you.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I think, there's this cliche now, whole of government approach. I think what we've seen over the past few years, it is the value of an effective, well-staffed, well-led coordinating mechanism at the national government level, that is the Space Council. There have been various experiments since the start on coordinating across these sectors and having a national approach to the program. And I think with what the Space Council has been able to do with the space policy directives, with a engaged staff, with enough people. I mean, when Nixon was president, there was a Space Council run by Bill Anders with over 20 staff positions. In the years since then, it's just been one or two folks in somewhere within the executive office of the president until now. Now there is a decent sized staff working at the Space Council. And I think that's demonstrated its value. And I hope it continues, whether it's called Space Council, whether it's an element of the National Security Council, but at the center of the government, a well-staffed, well-led coordinating mechanism to keep us pointed in the right direction.
So thank you, John. I'm going to open it up. Jeff and Marcia, if you have any thoughts, one of the things I would add to it is I think one of the things that's made the Space Council successful so far is what John has said and the attention that it gets at the highest levels of government. But Marcia and Jeff, anything you'd like to add to this discussion?
You know, I'll agree with John about the National Space Council. There was a lot of skepticism, I think, about the National Space Council. Why do we need it? You know, it had been a quarter century since the Space Council had last been active during the George H.W. Bush administration. And I think this administration demonstrated that a Space Council can be effective in, you know, trying to break apart some of those stovepipes and, you know, coordinate across that whole of government. And we've seen that with a series of space policy directives that's been effective in that. The question is, how do you institutionalize that so that it can survive a change in administrations, whether it's a Biden administration next year or another administration coming into office in 2025? How do we keep that momentum going in that respect? I don't know if there's any clear answer to doing so, but I think, you know, this administration has proven that the Space Council can be an effective tool in coordinating space policy on a broader national scale.
Great. Marcia, anything?
Yeah, I'd just like to echo what John and Jeff have been saying. I think we should emphasize how important it is that the person at the top of the Space Council, the Vice President, is really engaged in this. And also that you need to have harmony amongst all the people who are participating in this. So if you have someone running the Space Council who's at odds with the head of NASA or the head of the Space Force these days, or whoever's at the Department of Commerce or Department of Transportation, if you have that kind of conflict undercutting everything that they're trying to do, it's not going to work as well. So I think that, you know, the current Space Council and Vice President Pence have found a way to get everybody. I'm sure they have very robust discussions behind the scenes, but they do seem to be able to reach these agreements. And I really give them all credit for coming up with 5 space policy directives. Maybe we'll have another one. Scott Pace was talking some months ago about redoing the whole national space policy. So we'll see if there's any more yet to come. But I really agree that the Space Council, at least in this administration, I think has been very beneficial for the space program as a whole. And if they can get, you know, the sweet spot of cooperation and harmony and the right people in the right place, if they can keep that going or replicate it in future administrations, you know, however far into the future, I think that would be very helpful.
Yeah, and I would agree with all of you. I think all those points are well taken. So let me switch gears to one other topic, and I'm actually going to combine a couple in one. We hear the phrase constancy of purpose. What does that mean, and how does that translate itself when we have these unique circumstances that we are in now with pandemics, the rise of the entrepreneurial space community, all of the different programs we have ongoing, and the circumstance and leadership being able to navigate itself through all of these situations and maintain that constancy of purpose? How would thoughts along those lines that would be beneficial to the audience? Whoever would like to go first.
Well, I'll start again and do the history again. I think that we have, as a nation, been committed to going beyond Earth orbit at least since 2004. I mean, what we've been arguing about is destination, but you know, from the vision for space exploration of George W. Bush on, we've been spending several billions of dollars each year developing the capability to return to travel beyond low Earth orbit, and eventually we're going to do it. I mean, we are close to having at least some elements of the hardware. It doesn't seem to me to make any sense to build an SLS and not use it, or build Orion and not use it. I'll say this very quick. In July of 2000, I went to Baikonur and saw sitting there in a big hangar some unused Energia heavy lift rockets and a never used space shuttle. And that was very sad. And the idea that we would do that seems to me to be unthinkable. So I do think that one constancy is that we are going somewhere in this decade.
Marcia, Jeff?
Well, I would agree with that. I think we have had this constancy of purpose at the very top level, more or less Moon and Mars, although during the Obama administration, it was lunar orbit and not the lunar surface. So I do think that there is an overall bipartisan consensus that human spaceflight is a good thing and that we should be going beyond low Earth orbit. It always boils down to the money. And right now we have a $3 trillion deficit. And so I think that the policy, the constancy of purpose in terms of policy may continue, but I am a little bit worried about what's going to happen in terms of money as everybody tries to deal with the effects of the COVID pandemic. And I'm really not sure how that's going to turn out. Congress was having trouble reaching agreement on budgets long before COVID, and they certainly have not made much progress on the FY 2021 appropriations, as Jeff was explaining. So I do worry about that, but I think as a policy matter, I think the constancy of purpose is doing pretty well.
Would you agree with Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, we have this constancy of purpose. It's just taken a long time to come up with a consensus of how to do things, where to go, what sort of vehicles to build. And I think that reflects the fact that it's been, in a grander scheme of things, a relatively low priority, given everything else that's going on with the country and all the other priorities that we're facing. So I think, NASA deserves some credit for, making progress despite all those obstacles. The question I think that Marcia alluded to is what happens over the next year or two, again, regardless of what happens to the election, as we deal with the pandemic and the economic fallout from it, as that continues, will we be continuing to spend at these sorts of levels on space, given all of these other issues, giving emerging priorities like climate change? There are lots of potential obstacles in the path ahead. The question is, do we have that sort of constancy of purpose to maintain a path around those obstacles and head on to the moon and then again on to Mars?
Yeah.
Can I make one final remark then?
Most certainly, John.
Okay, one constancy of purpose, if you want to use those phrases, is that we've been operating the infrastructure set out by NASA in 1969. That is a space station serviced by a space shuttle. And we're still operating the space station part of it at multiple billions of dollars a year. We've been really basically having two human spaceflight programs, one in low Earth orbit and one ever so slowly returning to deep space human exploration. And at some point, I think we have to stop the LEO one, not just talk about stopping it.
And I, back to I agree with that, John. And one of the points I think Marcia made it was, one of the things we're taking on at AIAA is also to help with that advocacy for the overall industry, because of the importance of what aerospace is to the national economy, the global leadership. We will continue to push on that, recognizing the constraints and the challenges, but it's important that we don't lose sight of our future in the long haul. With that, Alan, I think it's time for me to maybe turn it over to you for audience questions and answers at this point, right?
All right, we have a few things that we can talk about. First one is John Logsdon. John, you talked about some consistency. You talked about the Space Council and how do you keep the effort of the Space Council moving forward. Is it time to have a department at the cabinet level? Got Department of Interior, do we need a Department of Space?
I'm not sure what difference it makes to be at the cabinet level or not. I mean, NASA has a larger budget than several cabinet agencies, probably has a broader economic impact in the country. So the symbolism of raising the space program to the cabinet level, I think, is a almost not worth the fight. But that's just a top of the head answer. I'm curious what Marcia and Jeff think.
Well, I think that in the past, when they talked about a Department of Space, it really hasn't been a Department of Space. It's been a Department of Science, and trying to bring together all the science agencies, and civil space would be part of that, not the national security space side. And of course, whenever you start trying to glom all these things together, they're going to be winners and losers. And so it may well be that NASA is doing better as an independent agency than it would be as one part of a much bigger cabinet level Department of Science. So I'm not sure, I agree with John, I'm not sure there'd be a lot of benefit to the civil space program by having that. And I would be very surprised if they wanted to really have a Department of Space that also brought in the national security sector. I think Space Force is where it is, and that's where it's going to stay.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'm not sure what problems you solve by creating a Department of Space or a Department of Science, versus the problems that you could potentially create through some sort of reorganization that does so. So I think NASA has, what it needs from an influence standpoint, being outside the cabinet right now.
All right, while you still have your microphone on, Jeff, the next one's for you. And that is, you talked about budgets a little bit. Is there a reasonable mechanism by which we can go to multi-year budgets for NASA, similar to the way ESA has multi-year budgets, even sometimes multi-decadal budgets for their different programs?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a push. There have been people in Congress that have pushed for multi-year appropriations for NASA, citing, the long time horizons required to develop some of these space capabilities. That really hasn't gone anywhere, in part because, some in Congress are reluctant to tie their future hands regarding funding for certain programs. So the ESA approach, where they meet every 3 years and get the countries to allocate funding, has a certain advantage in that respect. It had created some complications because you've got 22 member states that you have to negotiate with to provide funding. And then once they put their money in, they expect a certain return out of that investment. So that creates some complication from a contracting standpoint. So trying to do that with 50 states might be an interesting exercise. So you see the logic of a multi-year appropriation, but I don't see a lot of momentum to try and implement something like that, with NASA for the foreseeable future.
And Marcia, there's been lots of things talking, you referenced a little bit to about different regulatory regimes controlling different parts of the business. And that creates a thought process that says, if you go off and take the communications and Earth observations out of the space biz, it becomes a lot smaller than it currently is. When you look at the size of that resultant product, and you look at what's going on outside, and you've got multiple folks come in wanting to develop different systems and different mechanisms to utilize them, but they're all asking for regulations. Give me regulations for this, give me regulations for that. It's kind of a counterintuitive as to why you would want more regulations. So can you address some of those things that people get confused with when they see the folks that are leading space businesses come in and ask for more regulations?
Well, I think that what the companies want is clarity on regulations. They have investors who want to come in, and the investors are trying to decide, is this a good business to invest in? And one question they want to have is, so what kind of regulations are the government going to put on us? So I'm not sure that they want to have more regulations. They want to have certainty in regulations. They figure there's going to be some regulations there, and they would like to get them nailed down to some extent so that they can go out and convince investors to come in and put money into their business. And you certainly hear that a lot in commercial launch. Again, it's certainty that they're looking for. Also in the effort to get mission authorizations, because right now nobody regulates on-orbit activities. We have the FAA that does commercial launch and reentry, and you have the Department of Commerce that does commercial remote sensing, but you don't have people who are regulating right now the satellite servicing industry or other things that are going on in orbit. And so again, it's a matter of having certainty, not a number of regulations, whether it's a lot or a few, it's just having certainty.
Okay, and now one for the moderator. Hi, Dan. Wake up.
Hello.
And this comes from, this is in your position as executive director of AIAA. What has the COVID experience and challenges done to what you foresee as the responsibilities and the imperatives that the professional societies and the societies like AIAA do now versus before COVID?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would first of all say this, Alan, our mission has not changed. Our mission is still the same in terms of helping professionals and their organizations succeed in the aerospace industry. That is a constant. The tools that we use and how we use those tools have certainly changed. And what the silver lining in all this is that we have learned, and we've had to learn quickly, and I will give kudos to the AAS staff, the AIAA staff, everybody quickly learning how to utilize the online tools and use that to be able to reach out to broader audiences. Actually, what we have found in the AIAA world is that now that the travel barrier has been essentially removed, the global participation, the participation across the US has actually increased. We've run events with more participation now than we would have had if we did it in person. That said, our mission still remains the same. So we continue to take advantage of the tools, and we're using this as an opportunity to frankly retool the Institute for the future because it gives us more and more flexibility, it gives us more reach, it gives us a greater ability to reach out to professionals and organizations to help get the word out with events like this and use these new tools to our advantage.
All right. So that we're almost butting up against the end of our time. But I wanted to take a minute, and I'd like to have all of our panelists stay on because before we move on, we have one last special award to present to one of our panelists, John Logsdon. And it was really interesting watching John work with this panel and bringing the perspective of someone who's been in the industry longer than any of the rest of us, bringing that perspective to us and bringing the historian and the activist perceptive to things that we had never seen before. The Eugene M. Emmy Award, named for NASA's first historian, recognizes outstanding books that advance public understanding of astronautics. John's book, Ronald Reagan and the Space Frontier, explores how the 40th President of the United States gave rise to a repurposed American space effort during his 8 years in office. The book offers a comprehensive examination of how Ronald Reagan used his presidency to advance a vision for space that would eventually give the United States great triumphs in that realm, while also helping the nation deal with its first space-related tragedy in almost a decade. We're very happy John could be here today to receive this award. Congratulations, John. I know all the rest of the panel congratulate you also.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Alan. I can show the award also. And as everybody said about Fred Ordway, I knew Gene Emmy very well. When I first started in this business, he was the NASA historian and became a mentor for me in God, a long time ago. First time I met Gene was in August of 1967. So it has been a long career, and these awards make it, along with students, with books, with engagement with the community, all worthwhile. So thank you to AAS and thank you all.
Congratulations, John. All right, so that reaches the end of this panel. We'll come back at 2:35 Central or 3:35 Eastern for a couple of comments from our planning committee co-chairs, and then go into a closing session, a conversation between Mike Griffin and Scott Pace, which is always interesting to get them on the same telephone together. So we'll come back at 2:35 or 3:35, depending on your time zone. Thank you very much.